All right, so I wanted to make this video to explain loudness and how to achieve it in a mix because I think a lot of people get it very wrong or don't completely understand it. So this is the first video I'm making. I'm pretty sure this is going to be completely unedited. So bear with me here. I'm just going to be kind of rambling. I have some notes on what to talk about, but beyond that, there's not really a script. I'm just gonna be going through this track here. This is a track that I'm working on right now, and go through the process of mixing this track and achieving loudness in the mix. Um, so I'm not really going to be talking about loudness itself, as in whether or not you should be trying to achieve the most loudness, because that's a very, very contentious topic. And, there's a whole thing called the loudness wars about this that you can see online, a lot of content about it. Maybe I'll make a video about it one day, but this is just going to be about how you can achieve loudness in your mix and what it means. And more specifically, I'm going to be showing you how to achieve clean, punchy loudness. It's not going to be sounding really distorted or blown out. It's going to be following like generally good practices. And I'm going to be going into the real nitty gritty about it, and like actually just kind of making a full mix here with it. So I guess we should just start off with what actually loudness is and what makes something loud. So, at a high level, there's three different things: there's dynamics, frequency balance, and then the actual perceptual loudness that a human hears. Um, so the best way to kind of start, I'll play the pretty like raw version of this track. This is like obviously very, very early start of a track, but I think it's a pretty good one to demonstrate what loudness is. And I deliberately don't have vocals in this version of the project, because it's just going to make everything a little bit more complicated. So I'll just play this right here. So that's generally the track, and then there's this other part that I made just for this video, which is like a very loud, dense bass. Which, it's going to sound a lot better by the end of this video. The advice that I'm going to be giving generally will apply to like dance music, kind of like this. Again, the final version of this song is going to have vocals. Maybe I'll link it on the channel one day when it's done. But everything can be kind of applied across the board to all genres. I mean, even like rock, pop, etc. But this type of music is the easiest to demonstrate and explain some of the common problems. Like when you're using a lot of synthesizers or samples, the way that you would compress everything is going to be completely different than if you're working with a track that's entirely live recordings of instruments, because a lot of that comes down to how good the performance is for achieving loudness and how punchy, generally speaking, the recording and the performances of it. So I think going with like synthesizer based music is going to be quite a bit better here. And the arrangement is also the most important part of loudness, which I'll kind of explain as I'm going through this. So I think the first misconception to debunk and the first thing to explain is all of the meters that you see here in Ableton or any other DAW that you're using are generally not a good indicator of loudness necessarily. So I'm gonna just solo this drum track here. I'll go right over here, play this. So if we take a look at the meters here, there's going to be two different bars that you can see at the same time. So there's this one bar down here that's like a brighter color, which is an RMS meter. And then there is this other bar above it that's a lighter shade. Maybe there would be a better track to show this. Let's see this one. Yeah, so you see how there's two completely different bars right here? So this top bar is the actual peak value. So if you zoom all the way in here to this, right, you see how there's a bunch of dots? These are actually individual audio samples. So this is what the waveform is, right? Like all that an audio waveform is it's just a bunch of samples telling the speaker cone how far out or how far in it should push. There's no frequency information in an audio file, nothing. It's just a bunch of samples. And the peak meter right here is essentially telling you how close the sample is to reaching zero or clipping, right? And this one is called RMS, which is essentially the average of all of the samples over a long period of time. So that is a lot closer to what you would actually perceive as how loud something is, because your ear doesn't hear the instant little peaks, right? You can play a tone, and if you play a tone at one volume for a really short blip, and then you play it again for a longer amount of time, your ears are going to perceive the longer one as being louder, even though they're being played at exactly the same volume, right? So we can take this and then we can use it to our advantage to actually understand how to make something loud. Now, there's another meter that people use for loudness, which is LUFS. And LUFS is essentially the same exact thing as this RMS meter, but they basically put an EQ on it that looks kind of like this. So they're boosting everything over 1K to increase the loudness reading. And the reason for this is because your ears actually hear these frequency ranges as a lot louder than the low end. I don't know why that is. You know, it's probably because your human voices are in that frequency range, so your ears are tuned to hear it, or maybe it's because babies crying is in that frequency range. But generally speaking, right, anything in this frequency area over here playing at the same volume as something lower is going to be perceived as louder. Now, it's not this smooth, like there's little boosts and notches throughout in what you actually hear, and you can look this thing up called the Fletcher-Munson curve if you want to see it exactly what it is, but I really wouldn't think about that too much. So that's the kind of perceptual loudness and frequency balance part that I was talking about, right? Like if you have lower frequencies with more energy, those are going to sound quieter than the same energy played at higher frequencies. Now, the dynamics is the other part of the loudness that is very, very important too. And it's the part that's going to take the most work to get right. So if I go ahead and play this here, I'm just going to play the whole track at this section. So right off the bat, right, you'll notice how the bass and this sample are playing pretty loud. It's actually playing quieter than this melody, right? But this melody sounds a lot louder. It's a lot higher pitched, so it's going to eat through what you're hearing a lot more. And do I have a limiter? Yeah, I'll take this limiter off the master here. Make it a little quieter. So the first thing that we want to try to do in order to achieve loudness is just get the general fader balances of everything correct. So I already have a little bit of fader work here, and you'll see I have some groups, but I believe I'll even take all of the processing off of these groups. Don't think this has anything except the sidechain. Yeah, so ignore the groups for now. If we get the fader balance right, it's really going to do us a big amount of work here. So I would say this lead might be a little bit too loud. So I'm going to go ahead and pull it down a bit. And you'll notice that one of the reasons that this mix already sounds pretty well balanced and pretty good is because of the composition that I have. So this lead right here is the only thing that is playing in this octave, right? There's nothing else going on there. So this is gonna already punch through the mix. Like I can probably make this pretty quiet, and you can see, you can still hear it pretty clearly, even at over half the volume that it was just at before, right? And then we have this sample. this is playing pretty low. And then we have this one, which is playing at a very, very similar octave to this one. I think it's 1 octave lower if I had to guess. And this is a lot more textural, right? So you can see if I turn this one off, it's pretty difficult to hear that I just turned it off. So one of the very first things that I would do with the frequency balance is I would probably just put an EQ on this here. I can see this fundamental is playing pretty low. So I might bring up some of these other fundamentals quite a lot. Right, don't be afraid to make pretty aggressive moves here. Let's turn this up a little bit. Now I hear this fundamental is piercing through a little bit too much. I'm gonna pull that down a little bit. All right, I would say that sounds pretty good. For this one, all right, if we take a look at the frequency spectrum here, this is pretty much the only thing playing anything around 1K. So these upper harmonics, right, I can bring them up and it's gonna sound a little bit strange because you'll see it'll start to conflict with the hi-hats a little bit later. So the next thing that I'm hearing here, and again, we're just doing balancing and frequency, and the perceived frequency loudness right now. We're not really working on the dynamics at all yet. We're just getting this very like basic building block down first. So these hats, I think, are a little piercing. You can see they're clipping, but they're really not clipping. I have the main turned down quite a lot, so there's not gonna be any clipping here because DAWs work in floating point values. So this is not actually going to clip unless it's clipping out of the master. So I always just like to turn my master down so I can kind of like hover all of the tracks around 0, but that's just personal preference. So you can see these hats are a little bit piercing. So I might like, if I turn them down, they're going to just lose a lot of energy. They might work like right around there. I do want a little bit more sparkle, but what I'll do is I'll just put I'll just saturate these hats quite a lot. I actually might go a little bit over the top with it because I want them to be a little bit more tinny and kind of flat sounding. So and you'll notice that throughout this process, as I'm going through with this, I'm trying to keep the RMS metering as even as possible across the processing chain, right? So that way, like, you're not being tricked, because if you put processing on and it makes it louder, you're going to intuitively think that that sounds better. So I'm trying to keep everything as even as possible here throughout. As you can see, without the processing, it sounds quite a lot better. Now I might actually raise this in level. All right, that sounds pretty good. Now we've got our kick and snare. I actually think these sound completely fine as is. I wouldn't really do much to this. Like, you see, I'm not just putting something on every track for the sake of it. I'm just kind of hearing problems if there are any and then going off of that. Let me move over to this part where there's another lead. I already have an EQ on here, so I'll turn, because I forgot to get rid of that one. So now we're going to be running into a little bit of a conflicting situation, right? Because I have this lead playing. Let me just solo the melodies here. I'll turn off these two as well. So these are both overlapping around 1K quite a lot, right? But you can see the fundamental of this one is sitting in between 100 and 1K. So I might literally just pull down 1K. I'll also just get rid of this clicking sub. Pull down some of these as well. And already, just like that, they're deconflicted, right? This one EQ point really creates enough space between these two elements to start sounding pretty solid. And then you'd see, I can kind of add these two back in because this sample right here is playing quite low, right? I might just get rid of this sub, but and just like that, like, all of our melodies here are perfectly balanced, right? So again, when we're trying to achieve loudness, the very first thing we want to get is all of this correct. So you can see if I put a EQ on here, right, we have a pretty nice filled out frequency spectrum. We have enough room left over here for the hats to come through. We don't have like an obnoxious amount of low end on this. Everything is generally pretty good. And you'll see naturally the lower frequencies here are a little bit higher in energy than the high frequencies because I have to turn them up a little bit more for them to be audible. So that's just a sort of emergent property of doing it this way. So really the last thing that I would try to affect here is the bass. So I do think that this bass already sounds pretty solid as it is. You know, you can see we have a really strong sub. The only thing is that the bass with this track might be conflicting a little bit. Like you can see if we turn the bass off, we can hear this track a lot clearer now. I don't actually think this is a problem because I think these complement each other pretty well. So I'm just going to leave this as it is for now. And as far as the frequency balancing goes, I would honestly call this pretty good. The only thing that could possibly... I'll take this off, that's for later. The only thing that could possibly be something I want to do is I might want to add a little bit more top end to this snare. That sounds fine. So... once we've got all of these dealt with, right, let's take a look at what our LUFs are. Let me put a new instance of Pro L on here. So if you don't know, if you have Pro L, you can actually put it on a loudness metering mode so you can see the LUFs value of the track. So let me go ahead and push the track up. I'll put 1-to-1 mode on. So again, we're not being tricked by the perceived level increase. And let me just start cranking this up and see where we end up. I'm going to just keep pushing it up until we hear very obvious limiting. So if I flip this on and off, what I do here is this limiter is definitely affecting the hats quite a lot, right? It's bringing the hats top end up. Might back off of this a little bit. That's making very, very minimal changes to the sound, so I'm going to leave it here. And right off the bat, right, you can see that this snare hitting is really decimating our limiter quite a lot, right? So when you're putting a limiter on the master, you're going to have a balance between two different sides, which is either distortion or pumping, right? So in order to show you what like really intense pumping looks like, so you hear how the leads are swelling up and down with the drums. Right, and the other extreme of that is distortion. Right, where you hear how that's just really, really crunchy. So you're always going to find yourself on a limiter somewhere in between those two states, right? And the best state is generally none, but depending on the genre, right? If you have like a very heavy EDM track or like a dubstep track, the distortion is probably fine. You're probably not even going to notice it. So I'm going to go and back off the limiter again. I think we had it somewhere around here. Cool. And I'm just going to leave this on, right? So again, remember this is in 1-to-1 mode, so we're not actually raising the output volume of the limiter. So now let's talk about the dynamics part of this. So generally speaking, right, the limiter isn't reacting to RMS values. The limiter is going to be just reacting to these peak values, which if you remember from the metering is the more transparent part of the track here. So if you take these peak values and if you're able to bring the peak value closer down to the RMS value, that means that you're going to be holding the same perceptual loudness, but you're not going to be pinning your limiter as much, right? And there's a lot of different ways to do this. So the first way that you can do it is by putting individual limiters on the buses and the tracks. You can compress the tracks, you can clip them, and there's no one size fits all way to do it. It's just generally what you what you need to do for a given track depends on what the track is, right? So if we take a look at our melodies here, clipping is going to sound really bad on them. So I can demonstrate this with the saturator. So if I put this in digital clip mode, you hear all that crunching on the top there, I guess on the bottom. So you see how what we've done is our RMS is pretty much the same, right? But this value right here is significantly lower. So we have a lot more headroom without paying the limiter, but it sounds very smashed. So I probably wouldn't opt for a clipper because a clipper will generally work better on bass sounds. It'll work better on drums. These melodies though, all right, let's go ahead and take a Pro L. I'm going to also put this in the 1-to-1 mode on this track. I'm just going to bring it up. Go ahead and slow the attack down a lot, speed the release up. This is going to generally make it not be as pumpy. So there's a very, very small difference between these two versions, right? It's very hard to tell the exact difference here. But you can see we've sandwiched these two things together, right? Now, what's interesting is that you'll notice there is a little bit of artifacting, right? So you can see when I put the limiter on, a little bit more low end creeps its way through. If we go ahead and you'd think, oh, we can just filter that out. This is going to start splitting up our RMS to our peak value again, right? So generally speaking, right, I would just kind of ignore this, or I would make an effort to cut out a little bit more low end from this even. I mean, this is obviously going to change the sound a little bit, but in this case, I think it's actually a pretty desirable sound. You can see we have a little bit less low end build up there now. I don't know if it's exactly a problem though. I honestly am probably just going to keep it like this, right? So you can see now we have a very, very dense lead sound right here. Now, if we move on to the drums, which are very, very transient heavy. Well, actually, just the kick and snare. This is when things start to get interesting. So these drums sound good because they're very clicky. There's a very, very strong transient in these drums, right? So if I go ahead and put a saturator on this, let's go into the digital clip example like before. You hear how that's smashing the transient out of the way, and it's really distorting it? I still probably wouldn't go with clipping here. Clipping is very hard to get sounding good, right? Maybe we can do just a tiny bit. Right, so this is having very, very minimal of an effect. So I'd probably be okay with this, right? And you can see we've already condensed down these two values here. The next thing I'm going to try to do is I'm going to see what it sounds like if I compress these drums pretty hard. So I'm going to have a high attack value because I want to keep most of that initial transient in. But I'm going to have a very, very fast release, so it snaps right back. I'm going to start dragging this back. I think that sounds a little bit better. Now let's see what happens if I put the clipper after the compressor. And you can see there's a clipping mode on the saturator as well. See what it sounds like on soft clip. So we're losing a little bit of the transient. So I'm going to back off on the drive, put the output back up. So I think this sounds pretty good, right? This is pretty minimal processing, but you can see we've taken down a lot of this top end here, or a lot of the peaky values. Now, if we take a look at the limiter, notice how everything sounds almost the same, but you see we're not doing any limiting now, right? We've freed up a lot of room here in our limiter to bring it up even further. And you can see that the drums are pegging this a lot less than they were before. Naturally, the drums are always going to be hitting the limiter quite a bit harder than everything else, so I really wouldn't worry about it if you have, some limiting happening from the drums. But you can see how we just got an extra 2 dB of limiting out of this, right? Because you can see if we go to the melodies here, right, take this limiter off, and then we go to the kick and snare and then take these off. See how much more intense that limiting is? And I actually think it sounds louder now, and I think it sounds even better with this very minimal processing that we've done. Right, now the hi-hats I can also just tell from the sound are very, very peaky. Right, you can see there's a lot going on here. So I'm probably just going to throw a limiter on this, right? I already know from experience that if we were to just hard clip this, it's going to take a lot of the transient out of this. So let's go ahead and push this up quite a lot. Still losing a lot of the transient. Let me back off of this. Add a little more. So I'm okay with losing a tiny bit of the transient here, but we have brought this peak value down. Now the bass. So you can see I'm already compressing the bass, and you'll notice what's interesting about the Ableton compressor is it does have this RMS mode, right? So if we go ahead and solo this bass, put it to peak mode instead of RMS, you see how much more this is compressing just off of the peak values, right? So the peak is pretty high here. If we put it to RMS though, it's going to start compressing it less, because all that that's going to be doing is it's going to be reducing the dynamic range of this RMS meter, right? But it's going to be leaving the peaks alone. And you can see, right, I made this patch myself in Serum, and this patch doesn't have a ton of dynamics except for just this swelling motion, right? And I don't really want to lose that swelling motion, which is why all that I'm essentially doing with this compressor is I'm taking the bottom of this and kind of bringing it up a little bit, right? So there's less movement here going on from the bottom to the top. Right, so I'm just sandwiching those together. And I would say our bass is honestly fine like this. Now, one thing is that if you don't have good monitoring or very good headphones, you're going to have a hard time hearing the bass. And this is where metering tools come in. So this free tool called Span, I'm sure you've heard of it before. This is a very, very good indicator that can show you where your sub is hitting, right? So I'm on headphones and I have this playing through my headphones pretty quiet, so I actually can't hear the sub that well. So this sub is actually pretty quiet, right? And if you remember from before, when we were talking about what the different frequencies do to perceive loudness, this sub is going to take quite a bit more energy to be audible compared to these high frequencies, right? Like you can hear the hats are much, much, much louder than the sub, even though they're playing at pretty much the exact same value. So I have two options here. I can either just raise the sub, right? And you can see that sounds nice and thick now, right? I can really hear that coming through on my headphones. Or I can EQ only the sub up, right? It depends on if I want more of that womp out. So what I'm probably going to do is a little bit of both. I'm probably just going to raise my sub a little bit, and then I'm going to raise this. And as a general rule of thumb, right, if you have the level of your sub bass playing at about the same level as 1K plus, you won't be hitting the limiter too hard. Because one thing I notice a lot of people do that's a pretty big mistake is they'll have their sub like this, right? Because they can't hear very well, or maybe they're mixing on shitty headphones where the sub bass is not gonna come through. They'll do something like this, right? And you'll see how loud this peak gets. And if we take a look at our limiter, right? If we try to push our limiter up anymore, you see how the sub is just totally decimating the limiter? Like if I go and turn the sub off here, right? You see how much that limiter just got backed off by that? Right? The sub is just going to be smashing the limiter. But if we go back to this, we just bring it up a little bit, right? Let's take a look at our span right here and see what's going on. Now look at that, right? We're not really affecting the limiter that much still. We're in a pretty good spot. And this is very loud, and it's still very punchy, right? This is a very high LUFS reading. We could probably get away with even a little bit more. See what it sounds like without the limiter? Very hard to even hear what the limiter is doing there. Now, another thing that we might be able to see is like, there's quite a lot of mud region sounds going on. In this case, it kind of works though, right? Like you could, you know, I won't do it in the individual tracks. I'll put it on the master here. You know, something like this. Is naturally going to give us more loudness because this region is taking up a lot of energy, but it's not going to be perceived that loud. So if I do that, push it up a little bit more, like we're probably going to get into the -6 region pretty soon. Yeah. Right, and you can see it's still very hard to even hear that this limiter is doing anything. And if I take this off, right, we're getting a lot more limiting going on here. Cool. So I would say this sounds pretty good, right? I'm not actually too worried about this low end because I know vocals are going to be added in later. That's going to take up more of this top area, but let's go over to this other section now for the video ends. So this is a very, very full and very dense bass, right? You can see I already have some EQ going on. I think the second harmonic is a little bit too strong, so I'm actually just going to go into the patch here. I'm going to try direct outing this sub. Okay, so this sub is obviously, this bass sound, I should say, is pretty weak compared to the drums, right? But I can hear the sub is still very loud, right? So if we go and take a look at this in the metering here, right? You see the sub is quite a bit louder than everything else. I want to fill out this region quite a lot more, right, in this sound, which will bring a lot more loudness because we're introducing a lot more frequencies into this range right here. So a lot of different ways to do that, but the two most obvious are with OTT and saturation, right? So if we go ahead and put OTT on this, you can see how that shifted the balance, right? Where the top end had a lot more energy than the sub. And if we go to this little soft sine saturation mode, right, you can see this is going to also add a lot of energy here. And this is when you get into the more like creative sound design part of this, because you can see this is making a gigantic difference to the sound. Now I could probably bring this up in level quite a lot. Now maybe I don't even like this little pumping right here. I think that sounds a little bit better, right? Because I already have my own sidechain going on up here. Right, and you can see we've filled out this area quite a lot more. It's even a little bit louder than the sub. I still want some more energy though in this kind of lower area. So what I might do is I might just add another layer. Right, now I'm gonna only have one single thing playing the sub layer at a time, because we don't want any kind of phasing issues in the sub bass. But I'll just go ahead and make a completely new patch here and see what we can get going. I'm going to kind of isolate out this area. Right, I think that sounds pretty pleasant, right? That's really filling out that whole space quite a lot more. And if we take a look at the LUFS on this, right, we have like quite a lot of room to just smash this further, because it's a very, 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 very dense sound. Right, so if we really, really work hard on this part, we could get this extremely loud. So let me go ahead and get this. Let's give it quite a lot more saturation. Right now we're sitting around the -5 area. So that's very obviously being limited, right? You hear how much that jumped in volume when I took the limiter off? So I'm actually back off of the limiter a little bit. Okay. Let's go to this. Let's really smash this sound a lot more. And now in this case, I might go onto the bass bus itself here. Saturate this even further. Right, and then in this case, again, you can hear it's obviously distorting a lot. But look at that, right? We're sitting at about -3 LUFS here. Right, this is insanely loud. And you can see the limiter is not really doing a whole lot. But the reason that it's this loud is you can see we have a pretty fair balance between the sub frequencies and these higher up frequencies like this. This mud region is down a lot. And we have an incredibly loud signal coming through, right? This is much louder than you would ever realistically need to be. But we're still hitting it. And notice how the drums are still clean, right? This is obviously to do with the sidechain going on. If I take this off, drums sound terrible. But now if we go back over here, you'll see this bass is going to also be a lot fatter because we put this on, but I actually don't mind it that much on this part. It does make this bass a little bit more prominent though, so if I'm going to be going into this saturator, I probably would turn this down a little bit. And yeah, that's about it. I think that kind of covers everything about how to get a very loud mix and how to do it in a way without just totally destroying your sound. Let me know if you found this video helpful. I have more that I'm planning to make that should be coming pretty soon. I might go more into the editing of them and make them less like just a talk through video like this. But yeah, thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions.